I think it's important, regardless of what you're doing in the Army, you should try and get something on the calendar outside of work that excites you, because training just to train is not sustainable. You need a goal, so that you can go through the periods of training appropriately. And then on the other side of that, you can go into your recovery cycle. And it's also important to link that up with your work schedule.
Are you ready? Do you know what you're going to say?
Good, yeah.
Hey, guys. God, I just yelled. Hey, guys. Welcome to Mops and Mo's. This is Drew and Alex. Alex, who are we talking to today?
This would be a good one. We're kind of continuing our conversation about like the general Zone 2 theme. If you listen to Scott's episode, which was one of our most popular so far, this is a little bit a continuation of that. Our guest is Vince Paikowski, current active duty captain in the Army. Got his start running Division I cross country and track at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and was also an ROTC cadet there. Commissioned as an intelligence officer in 2017. People might have made some assumptions that he was infantry, but it's always cool to see MI nerds getting after some fitness. Vince, along with his competition partner and fellow Ranger Regiment Lieutenant Alastair Keys, won the 2021 Best Ranger competition in, frankly, dominating fashion. They took the lead on day one of the 3-day competition and never gave up that lead for the rest of the event. They're also both University of Wisconsin graduates, so I don't know what University of Wisconsin is up to with their training programs, but maybe there's something in the water. Since winning, he's gotten involved in sharing the lessons he learned in that process, coaching a whole bunch of subsequent teams. 75th Ranger Regiment has taken a lot of the lessons learned from his win for their programming. He's also helped out with the 4th Infantry Division teams. This past year, teams that were either coached by him or using the same template he used for his training finished 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 6th, and 7th. So they did have one team sneak in there on them, but that's a pretty dominating performance again. And for the 4th Infantry Division, year-to-year improvement, they previously had not a single team make it out of day one. And after using this template, all of their teams made it out of day one, and one of their teams finished 7th overall. Like I said, we've talked about this in previous episodes with the uphill athlete paradigm framework to training. Vince's approach is heavily shaped by uphill's concepts, and we're going to talk about a few of the key elements he used. Heavy emphasis on cardio base building, some conversation about fueling during the event, and just multi-day durability and the benefits that good aerobic capacity have on your ability to function in various other domains.
Yeah, so if you don't know what the Best Ranger competition is, we get into that as well. He kind of walks through at a higher level some of the flow of the different events, what it kind of means to take on a multi-day competition like this. And I mean, if anybody is familiar with it, you'll kind of recognize how, I mean, impressive is a good word, but just how insane it is really that coming at it from this more endurance-based approach landed teams, like you said, in 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 6th, and 7th. Like, that's insane. So yeah, this is definitely a good one. There's a lot of practical takeaways. Being active duty, I think Vince has a great perspective on how you can take what might at first glance appear to be a lot of volume and fit it into a normal day-to-day kind of workflow. So yeah, enjoy this one, have fun, and yeah.
Run slow.
Run slow. Your background is in cross country, right?
Correct. Yeah. I ran 4 years Division I cross country and track and field.
Do you find, or did you, obviously, I mean, this is like a softball question, but the way in which you trained for Best Ranger and kind of the way you go about training now, do you look back on that and think we were doing things right or we were doing things wrong?
So I think the program that I came from was not super strength focused. It didn't have a great background on the strength side. And I think that is where I lost a little bit of capacity and capability. I think too often endurance athletes shy away from strength training because they think there's a huge correlation between strength training and weight gain, and power to weight ratios change then. But I don't think that's actually the case. And you can get a lot of return from your neurological system and the ability to fire more muscle fibers repeatedly off of strength work. So on that side, I thought we were doing it wrong. But in terms of volume and the workload, I mean, I think that carries over well to the military side.
I see that happen. I mean, I have this conversation a lot with guys where they're either one or the other. Like they come in with a sort of preconceived notion of like, and sometimes they'll wrap it up in science, like, oh, I'm a type 2 guy, or I'm a type 1 guy. But it's like, I'm an endurance guy or I'm a strength guy. You see very little crossover. I guess you see more of it now, but man, I remember early on, and especially in the tactical space, like they were either a runner or they were a lifter, and there was not anything. So it's interesting that you saw that at a cross country level too, although it's not surprising, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that crossover is exactly like what we need in the force more and more. If you focus too much on strength, you become pigeonholed in one way, and you focus too much on in endurance, you become pigeonholed in another way. But I always think back to, train for best ranger. It's like, what is the maximum strength that is required to complete this competition? Is 340 pound, repetition deadlift enough, to do well at the competition and in so do well at your job? Probably, right? There's probably a maximum amount of strength relevant to our occupation. But on the other hand, is there a maximum amount of endurance that you could reach that you'd say like, oh, I'm good to go. Like I'm bulletproof. And that's where I think like the argument becomes, well, there's not really a maximum level of endurance you can reach to say like, hey, I'm good. Because expanding your endurance only allows you a further capacity to endure longer operations, a more privated event. If you're talking a large scale combat operation and moving several hundred miles over the course of a few days, well, then endurance is going to be the limiting factor there. And as long as you have the minimum required strength necessary to complete your job or to pull somebody out of a combat situation or to move under load, then you probably have enough strength and it's time to start focusing on building an engine.
I think Drew kind of said this already, with people tend to pigeonhole themselves as endurance people or strength people. And I think to a certain degree, I'm not that bothered if an individual pigeonholes themselves in terms of what they really do, because at least they're doing something and that's better than nothing. But I am a little bit bothered by it from the standpoint of coaches and leaders, like enforcing that pigeonholing on a group of people based on just their kind of preference and comfort zone, rather than like an actual decision that it reflects the demands of the job that they're training these people for. And that's where I get frustrated, is I think people aren't really analyzing the demands that they're training people for. They're just training the thing that will make them look good in front of others usually. Mm-hmm. And that's real frustrating in terms of the consequences on people physically.
Absolutely. I think, although recently the Army came out with their new ACFT, and it's definitely not perfect, right? But they added a plank in there, and there's a lot of mixed feelings about that. But when you look at the plank, you see a lot of guys who look like they are in, phenomenal shape, or, go to the gym often, and all of a sudden a 3-minute and 40-second plank, a minute and a half into it, you see their whole body shaking. And you're like, well, maybe though, like the muscle groups you're training aren't directly functional to, the task you're being asked to complete. Maybe focusing on, the physique and the way you look isn't actually the functional capacity required to do your job. And I think there's still a disconnect there. And, you can look one way, but it's not directly correlated to your performance.
You picked a scab there because Alex has a soft spot in his heart for the leg tuck, and held more than one small funeral for the leg tuck when it went away.
It's true. People knew I was the leg tuck guy, and the day it got taken out of the test, my phone was blowing up so much I had to turn it off for a few hours. It was a problem. RIP.
That's good to know. That's good to know.
Man. Yeah, just don't talk about leg tucks. We'll be okay.
Yeah, that's good to know.
Okay, so turning the spotlight kind of on Best Ranger. So what year did you win?
So I won in 2021, so just about a year ago.
Okay, and then
a little over a year ago now.
So kind of coming up in the ranks, and as you entered into the military and then we're moving around, like when did you kind of set your sights on that? How early did you start dedicating your training to that? And then we'll kind of get into what some of the training itself looked like.
Yeah, so I had first heard about Best Ranger, I think the way all Ranger students hear about the Best Ranger competition, and that was I was coming up against a Ranger recycle situation, right? If I did not get out of Ranger school by a certain point, I would be in the Best Ranger recycle, which means you're there for an additional 8 weeks, basically as the labor to put on and execute the Best Ranger competition. So that's really where I first came to know it. And then getting out of Ranger school, actually in 2019, the opportunity came for me I was kind of between positions, and they offered me 3 months to train for the Best Ranger competition. And I thought, oh, this is awesome. It's going back to kind of the collegiate days of being a full-time athlete and really getting to learn the craft as a brand new second lieutenant in the Ranger Regiment. And so I took full advantage of that opportunity and trained pretty hard with a good friend of mine, Scott Rapwano. And we had thought, we had bulletproofed everything. We had gotten in good shape, and then the gun went off in 2019. And unfortunately, Scott's core temp got away from us, and we got pulled from the competition. And he had a core temp of 107.2, and that happened on day one. So I like to say that I also took last in the Best Ranger competition in 2019. And then from there, I was asked to, do you want to try it in 2020? I kind of said, I don't really want to take a whole nother year to prep for this. And then I actually broke my ankle during that time. So it was off the table completely. And I think, as happens to a lot of athletes, as you sit there with an injury, you're like, hey, if I can get this back, I don't want to let an opportunity like this go again. If the opportunity presents itself and I can get back in shape and I can rehab my ankle, I want to try and train for the Best Ranger competition again. And I was actually in Afghanistan, and my boss had hit me up about coming back. And at that time, my friend Alastair Keys was also in Afghanistan. We were kind of closing up shop, and there wasn't a lot going on. So I asked him if he would be interested in doing it with me. He had done it in 2019 as well and taken second. And from there, we got on a plane, flew home, and started preparing for the thing. But it became like kind of a 3-year long process about thinking about the competition, the little aspects of the competition, and really the intangibles that I think get overlooked in the military often. How are you going to fuel? How are you going to rest? How are you going to hydrate? What's the best protocol for carb loading prior to a 3-day event, or sodium loading, prior to a 3-day event? Things that I think we take for granted a lot in the military. And it's just like, no, just show up and figure it out, were kind of the things we began to obsess about slowly over time and piece together.
We got a lot of dietitians who are really happy to hear those.
I feel like we should, for the sake of people listening, can you just give like an overview of what the 3 days generally looks like for folks that have no clue what Best Ranger competition entails?
Absolutely. So when you think about the Best Ranger competition, you can break it down into 3 days of semi-continuous activity. They say it's about 70 to 80 miles over those 3 days, but it's spread into about 30 different events. And each event, you're racked and stacked against all the other competitors. There's 52 teams, and you compete in a buddy pair. So it's you and one other person as a team against 52 other teams. And to kind of give like a general rundown, day one, we'll probably start with some longer cardio movements, a swim before you're going into some marksmanship, shooting different types of weapon systems, either in movement or stationary. And then going into, a night road march that is usually pretty significant in length, anywhere from, 16 to 22 miles long. And they usually try to frame that as a unknown distance. So you just kind of start and you go until you reach a finish line. And then you go into a night iteration of testing different skills, whether it's medical or communications equipment, or, you're back on a marksmanship range at night. And then you come back, you maybe sleep for 30 minutes and you wake up the next day and you're getting tested again on different stakes that we believe are important to the Ranger fundamentals. So, your ability to move, shoot, communicate, apply self-aid, and work as a team is constantly being tested during the competition. And then you go into the next night, and it's a land navigation iteration where you may cover, 18 to 22 miles again at night. And you finish off day 3 with a few more ranges, some obstacle courses, and kind of the fanfare of the final run. But each of those events as you go on is its own event. You're ranked in that event, and then each event has its own weight. So you have to kind of sit down with the historics of the competition to understand it. But for example, the night road march usually has a weight of 7. So if you win the night road march and there's 54 teams, you get 54 times 7. And then, something that might just be a knots test might have a weight of 1. So if you win it and there's 54 teams, you get 54 times 1. So it becomes, very much a game of strategy of where am I going to push and where am I going to hold in reserve? And what is my partner really good at that we can maximize? And then where do I really excel? And how do we balance those two things out from event to event so that no one guy is constantly bearing the load throughout the weekend?
Which, just out of curiosity, what was as a team, like your strongest event, and what was your weakest?
I think in generalities, the movement events were for sure our strength. We had gotten up to some pretty voluminous training. We were tapping about 100 miles a week, during our peak phase between running and ruck walking. And so I think that's really where we excelled. We degraded less than others over time. Everybody comes to the competition as a stud. There's 54 teams there. They're all in phenomenal shape, but really the crux of the competition is not degrading over time. And that's really where we get into the conversation of, endurance versus power versus strength, and where are you going to kind of give up something to gain something else. And then in terms of our weakness, it probably came in marksmanship, to be completely honest, relative to the teams we were competing against at the top end. Some of those teams absolutely outshot us throughout the weekend. But that was also one of those things that, they're shooting far above our capability on day 1. But as they begin to, degrade and reach fatigue, they're also then limited in their ability to perform those actions that are usually muscle memory to them. And that's where, we could begin to hedge some of that loss in marksmanship.
So I asked this specifically because you said ruck walking rather than just saying rucking. And this is a common question people ask all the time, but what do you think about ruck running specifically in training, not necessarily competition?
Yeah, so I think, running with a ruck should almost be seldom, if never done. And the primary factor is, if you are running, you are increasing the load on your joints relative to walking. And now if you are running with a substantial load on your back, you are exponentially increasing that load with every strike. Compounded on that military boots are not necessarily designed to withstand that impact, is just a recipe for overuse injuries, especially. Now, the flip side to that, in ruck walking, I will say, walking is something that you can do kind of ad nauseum without a lot of risk to injury. And what a lot of people fail to do is train a lot of these small muscles associated with walking, your hip flexors, your upper glutes, your lower back, that really get taxed just from walking. And you can train your body to walk substantially faster than, the Ranger standard of 15-minute miles. And if you can begin to harness that ability, well, now you've just eliminated running from the equation altogether, and you have a plan for longevity, and being prepared to really manage the weight over time.
I want to just underline that and ask anyone listening to rewind a minute and just listen to it a couple times, especially for Drew. He's at Fort Bragg. He gets to see all the shenanigans going on there. And a particular shout out to the advocating training hip flexors. I think kind of an underrated thing that nobody really addresses, but it's kind of at the core of a lot of tactical occupational demands.
I was laughing when you said that because, not to throw Fort Bragg or Fort Liberty, I suppose, under the bus, but I had to stop my car this afternoon because they were ruck running across the street. So on the way home, I was like, oh, this is a waste of everyone's time. So yeah.
Yeah. and I think it goes with the mentality of the military, right? Everybody wants to push. Everybody thinks, more or harder is better. But if you think about, how operations are even set up, at Ranger School, the first thing you do when you react to contact is you drop your ruck, and then you begin reacting to contact. You're not going to run into position normally with your rucksack on or under your maximum load. The goal there is just to move slowly with your load to get it in place so that you can conduct the operation, and it can sustain you. If you have to remain over day or remain overnight, but very rarely, are you going to be asked to run with a ruck in a realistic scenario.
Yeah, it's weird that I mean, because it's one of those things where, especially now, I think that there's a lot more folks involved in sort of tactical training. Like the ruck running conversation seems to come up a lot, and I've not that I can think of. I've not spoken with somebody who was like a massive advocate of it, but you still see it all the time, and you still see it as a leading cause of injury. And I think what it boils down to is like on the day, if I'm the NCO in charge of PT and I want to do something hardcore, like we're going to throw a ruck on and we're going to run. And then after the fact, yeah, like maybe that's not the best idea. But then like next Tuesday, you're going to do the same thing. So I guess the question that I have baked in there, and this is really for both of you guys, obviously Vince being active duty and Alex prior, but like, how do you even go about changing that stigma? How do you inject lower intensity, longer duration? I mean, I don't want to call it boring, but like, how do you inject that stuff into the psyche of training? It's a massive question, I know.
It's $1 million question. Yeah. If we could figure that out, we'd have a pretty lethal force.
Well, I guess so, Vince, for you, because I know as part of winning Best Ranger, correct me if I'm wrong, but like that comes with a lot of debriefs. I'm assuming with a lot of commanders being like, "Hey, man, like, how did you guys do it? What worked best, et cetera?" Like, how is that conversation received when you kind of dive into some of this?
Yeah, so I had the opportunity to train 2 times with the 75th Ranger Regiment, and they really put together a world-class apparatus to train for the competition between marksmanship instructors, physical trainers, endurance coaches. And when we had first looked at the competition, we approached it, I think, from the mindset that most of the military approaches the competition and training in general. It was, hey, a lot of these are high intensity activities, so let's train high intensity and let's try and replicate, these 3 to 10 minute long bouts that you're going to have to incur. And then the second time we looked at the problem set, we're like, well, it probably doesn't matter as much who can, win the hit the first day. What probably matters more is, can you win the hit on the third day? And if you can win, that high intensity interval style competition on the third day, well, then you're probably going to do better in the competition overall because you're more prepared over time. But I think it was very difficult to, go in that direction of, okay, let's put away this high intensity training and let's just do this long duration, like you said, boring, because it's monotonous activity. But what that monotony trains is a few things, right? You're training, the biological factors of zone 2 training that we all know well. You're training, resistance to impact and just time on feet. You're training the necessity to fuel on the go. And you're training the monotony of just being out for a long duration, which is mentally exhausting, especially when you start stacking those segments day after day after day. So it was really difficult to, go in that direction. And then once we did, like the program saw massive success. We, Al and I won in 2021. The Ranger Regiment basically swept the competition in 2022. And as they're adapting that model, what they're really doing is a proof of concept for, what we're really talking about. That long, slow duration activity holds a greater effect long term. Now, how you switch that in people's minds is the $1 million question. I know, Ranger has the 8-minute mile, for 5 miles set in their head that's the standard. And so every time they go out the door, they're going to run 8-minute miles. Well, if you're a 39-minute 5-mile guy, it's not smart to run 8 minutes every day. In fact, you're actually degrading your ability to run 39 minutes over time. You're only going to get hurt. But if you can start teaching people that, hey, 12 minutes, 13 minutes a mile, if that's what you have to do to just get out the door and relax and be in that easy pace, then that's what you have to do. If you have to walk, at a certain point because your heart rate is spiking, then walk and get your heart rate back under control, and you'll build that engine over time to then sustain those 8-minute miles that you want to achieve. But it's that foundation is not built overnight. And I think the mindset is super hard to break in the current workout culture that we have.
So I'll share a brief story and then I'll ask a question. But the story I've shared it with a bunch of people, but I don't think I've shared it on the podcast before. It was the first master fitness trainer course I taught. It was at Fort Bragg. I think it was an E5 infantryman. He turned in his program for the first week that he was going to run his unit through when he got out of the course. And the first thing is a 5-mile run at 8-minute mile pace. And I'm like, all right, cool. So like you're crushing that Ranger standard then, right? He's like, no. So I'm like, all right, so why would you like write down that that's gonna be your very first workout if you know you can't do it? Like, oh, because it's the standard. Like, I don't. This is like Drew's original question was, how do we like break this out of the culture? And I don't know, but it involves like having this conversation over and over again until it gets through people's heads that like the idea is to get people to the standard, not to just beat them over the head with the standard. Because like most people can achieve that standard if they train for it reasonably, but most people will get hurt if they're not ready for it and you just beat them over the head with it. So coming back to what you said about just kind of resilience and tolerating time on your feet and all that, what percent of teams make it to day 3 at all in Best Ranger?
So they make cuts throughout the competition. So if you're not top 28 in day 2, you get cut. And then if you're not top 16 going into day 3, you'll get cut.
Okay. So it's not, there's less of like a serious attrition concern and more of just like, they're just going to rack you and like cut however many people are below the line.
Correct. However, for example, this year in 2022, the night road march was set for about 20 miles. They had a grueling day 1 this year. And there were 8-9 teams that couldn't maintain, a 20-minute mile to meet the standard to complete that 20-mile ruck march. And so they got pulled from the competition for not meeting the standard. And if you think about, these are some of the, best the Army has to offer coming. And after one day of activity, they are degraded to the point where they can no longer meet 20-minute miles. You're starting to see the issue with how we train as a force and the preparedness level to move long distances at a time.
Yeah, that's one thing, like kind of outside of that event and outside of some particular schools, we don't often test like multi-day tolerance of volume in any serious way. And so you're basically tested on how you can perform in like a couple hour domain at the maximum, when like a more realistic scenario in terms of like what combat might throw at you is, can you dial it back a couple notches, but then repeat it day after day after day? And I think that's a real conversation about what endurance demands might look like.
And I think, we have to give people the benefit of the doubt too, because the past 20 years of GWAT have contributed to the mindset we're currently in, right? You drive to, or you are flown to the target. You fast rope in, you get out your vehicle, you conduct an operation, you get back in your vehicle, you drive back to the COP or the FOB or, the base, wherever you're going to be. And we could do that because we had such overmatch in our capabilities, right? You could fly a Chinook right up to the building and be fairly certain that you can still operate successfully next to that building. And that's a function of the conflict we were in, but if you start going back to Vietnam or Korea or World War II, it's a completely different story where you don't have that overmatch. So the only way to get in position is to physically move your force, by foot or by, vehicle to a location, dismount, move further, and then seize the objective. And I think one thing we're going to see in the force is as we start to, focus away from the counterinsurgency style fight and back to the large scale combat operation fight, at least I hope, we'll start to refocus on what does it take to move a force 30 miles by foot. and then successfully conduct an operation. And I think that is a wildly different problem set than the one we've experienced, and most of the leaders in the Army have been built up through.
And I think there's also a flip side of that, because you're going to hear a lot of people saying like, well, that's not really my job in the Army, and we don't train that way, and that's not what I'm going to do, and it's not realistic, and that's a hypothetical, and a million different reasons they'll come up with for not seeing that as the most convincing argument. But I think the argument that's kind of unavoidable for everyone is the injury risk in training conversation, right? Because that style of training at like progressively higher volumes, but at relatively low intensities, is the way you kind of get around that risk of injury, which is the thing that's currently limiting our readiness the most, right? The thing that produces the most days lost of duty time is injuries right now. And those injuries are coming from physical training, not even tactical training, not missions, not combat, none of that stuff. The thing that's limiting our readiness the most significantly right now is injuries caused by the training we're doing at morning PT. And that's just as valid a conversation as the hypothetical about what combat might look like.
Well, I think the other interesting thing too, because I don't even think we've yet approached the topic that Vince just brought up, which is the nature of warfare sort of dictating the training. It's incredibly interesting. But I think also alongside of that, if you look at just the fitness space, and I say this as not someone who's in the military, but as somebody who has grown up in that space, it's massively biased towards high intensity, towards strength, towards, hey, this 30-second clip that I can put on social media. Like we've said this before, you can't film yourself running and like get a bunch of followers. And so I think a lot of that, for better or for worse, I think I'm a proponent of CrossFit. I've seen a lot of goodness come out of CrossFit, but I also recognize that style of training, especially when you layer it with like this tactical veneer, with hero wads and whatever, like that starts to drive the way the culture thinks about what right looks like. And then you combine that with something that I know, Alex, you and I talk about all the time, which is this incredibly limited PT window that happens at a set time of day. Well, now if, again, I'm an NCO, I got to cram as much stuff into that as possible. I'm not going to say, hey guys, let's go for a long, easy run. Even if I know that's the right move, because the fitness culture, the military culture, et cetera, are all going to drive me towards, let's just crush dudes and make a sweat before we go eat breakfast and then report to work. Now I'll get off my soapbox. I do that a lot, but I'll get off the soapbox now.
Well, I'll pitch that question to Vince, which is, how do we take this and like, given the constraints that most people are not getting phone calls and say, would you like 3 months to train for Best Ranger? They're getting phone calls and saying you have CQ in 2 hours and things like that.
Yeah, you got a urinary analysis in the morning, man. You can't go to PT.
So how do we take these lessons and apply them in like a realistic day-to-day environment for most tactical professionals?
Yeah, so I mean, first and foremost, I think it's education, right? Things like this, or just going to your force and being transparent with them that, hey, the next 2 months of training in the morning is not going to be sexy. It's not going to be, super flashy. It's not going to be super anything to write home about. But after those 2 months, we're going to retest, against some of these standards, and we're going to see where the improvement is. And if you don't see or recognize improvement in 2 months of, adopting this sort of protocol, then okay, go back to what you've been doing. But, the research would suggest that after 8 weeks, you're already going to see, pretty substantial returns, especially if it's something that your body hasn't been introduced to before. So I think education is first. And second, something Drew had alluded to, leaders need to do a better job of violently protecting training. And not just the training behind a rifle or behind a gun, or, when you're at the range or at live fire, the physical training in the morning needs to be violently protected. UA, once you brief for UA, they have 24 hours to report. I could give the UA brief at 9:30 in the morning instead of giving it at 6:30 in the morning. And the soldiers will still come report throughout the day, to deliver their urine sample. Well, I've just protected, the fundamental thing that the Army does. I think it was the last Sergeant Major of the Army said, PT is not the most important thing we do in the Army, but it's the most important thing we do every day. And building that consistency and that culture that, hey, this is something that we will do regardless of what's going on is super valuable. And on the flip side to that, like, just because PT hours occur between 0630 and 08 or 09 or whatever your unit, dictates, doesn't mean that if you're an infantry team leader, you shouldn't be, trying to carve out time for your guys at 1430, 1530 to get back in the gym and get after some strength, or, hop on a rower for 30 minutes. Too often I hear at the lower levels, we're not doing anything right now. We're just sitting around. Well, sitting around is a failure of lower leadership to not, impart some sort of training. When I talk to, some guys from Special Missions Unit, I think people would be surprised at the way they train, right? They have guys who will go dry fire for 2 hours against the wall, becoming very, very competent at their skill set. Well, if we told someone in the conventional Army, go dry fire your weapon against the wall for 2 hours, you would probably get a lot of complaints about that. But that level of monotony and that level of, disciplined initiative is what it takes to, take your organization from just another organization in the Army to really a great organization in the Army.
I had a company commander early on. One of his lines was that if you're doing PT or you're doing maintenance, you're not wrong. Like, when in doubt, just like go do one of those things, and it's going to be better than what you were doing otherwise.
Yes.
I think that was a pretty safe rule. And we have this like two things to add to this, just as kind of background info. One, I routinely hear, and this has been more common since the ACFT, which requires some like strength and things that might require equipment to train. But I hear from a lot of people that we don't have the facilities and equipment to train for this test. And I disagree. Like, it's nice if we can get more facilities and equipment, all that stuff's great. But we just don't have the facilities and equipment for everybody to train at the exact same time. So if we say that every Monday has to be running and every Thursday has to be rucking, you've already limited down to 3 days, and probably less than that, the number of days that people can like even touch the equipment and facilities that do exist. And if you don't ever utilize them outside of that 6 to 8 window, you're really handicapping yourself for no reason on your ability to train the way you want to train. And then I think this was coming from 3rd Brigade 82nd's page, but they did like a little bit of rough back of the napkin kind of math to figure out how many PT days we actually realistically have. And it came out to less than half of the days in the year. I think their tally number was 178 once you subtract block leave, once you subtract holidays and Donzas, once you subtract like a pretty conservative estimate for time in the field and all that kind of stuff. We have so many things that like limit what we have left that you really have to make the most out of what's still available. And if you're sacrificing that casually, I think you might need to do the math on return on investment kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I'm looking at, and this is a good segue, I'm looking at, Vince, your typical training week, and of all this different session, like very little of this requires equipment outside of running shoes, a ruck, access to an obstacle course. I mean, you could inject, granted this is specific for Best Ranger, you could inject some additional stuff if you're just sort of in the conventional force, but just because the ACFT has a deadlift doesn't mean I need a full collegiate weight room to like work out. I don't know where that got lost in the sauce, but it's like, oh, because there's a trap bar component to this test, now I need Alabama's weight room. Otherwise, I'm not going to work out because I don't have access to stuff.
Drew, you're about to get crucified by
probably.
conditioning coach.
My coaches are not going to. Well, to be fair, we've prefaced this with a lot of conversations about running. But I mean, Vince, can you, and just for context, I'm looking at your run, ruck, lift, O course skills, your typical week, Monday through Friday. I mean, you're doing easy runs in the morning, afternoon rucks, a lot of lower, you mentioned this in your notes as well, a lot of lower body, like muscular endurance type stuff that we can get into. And then the interesting piece to me, especially with the endurance conversation around sort of the cognitive component of training, is the skills piece of it. Did you find, as you kind of went along with this, as your aerobic capacity was increased, you had a leg up on some of the skills components as opposed to folks that may not have had that background?
Yeah. So one of the things I sat down with data from 2017 to 2019 in the best ranger competition. I took, how guys placed in the initial cardiovascular event, which was an 8-mile run for those 3 years, and then looked at how they performed on skills day 1 versus day 2. And what you saw is the individuals who had a higher aerobic capacity on day 1 performed relatively better than their peers on day 2. So, you might have someone who's not aerobically fit who takes first place in their skills day 1, but they're last place day 2 because they've degraded so much in a cognitive ability, right? Eventually, if you're not conditioned neurologically, you're going to fatigue. And when you fatigue neurologically, your brain starts firing not as fast as you're used to it firing. And when that happens, you get the normal kind of deer stuck in a headlight of what am I even supposed to do with this skill right now? Where is this supposed to go? So I think absolutely there was a linkage there. But more than that, something we tried to implement is constant and consistent rehearsing. If it was how to establish a mortar point as fast as possible. I had a job, my partner had a job, and we would rehearse that, before we would go for a run. Then on the run, we would do verbal repetitions, while we're running of, hey, okay, I do this, you do that, A, B, C, D, E, F, until you're down through the list and it's established. And then you come back off the run and you try to accomplish that task again. And what you notice right away is without even touching the equipment for that, 45, 60-minute long run, you've become more competent at the skill. And you kind of have this time to train that you don't even realize you have until you start maximizing it in an efficient way. But I think those two linkages definitely exist to be more successful at the skill sets.
Well, it's interesting you say that because, talking about getting guys to go slower to kind of hit that zone 2 thing. If you were to inject, it's a little nerdy, but if you were to inject verbal training within like a platoon formation run, you kind of default to that pace anyway. So, hey, there's a tangible training tip for everybody. Just start talking while you run.
Yeah. And if you can't talk, you're probably doing it too
probably going too fast. Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
This is a constant question I've received because Vince, the whole zone 2 conversation has been very popular in a few different audiences over the last several months. That's part of why we're having this conversation. But one of the constant questions is like, this organization defines zone 2 this way, and this one defines zone 2 this way. And should I be doing it based on heart rate, or should I be doing it based on heart rate reserve, or should I be doing it based on lactate threshold, or like a million different definitions of what zone 2 is, and everybody's got their own zones and stuff. And I think honestly, there's no need to overcomplicate it. I've been recommending people move towards like subjective measures as much as possible. And I tend to use either, can you breathe through your nose and still sustain this? Or can you talk in full sentences and still sustain this? Or is that like, what do you use as your, like, I am at low intensity now, and how would you tell people what to do?
Yeah, no, I'm spot on with you. You should be able to talk in full sentences with your buddy. Like the thing I always loved about running, even at the collegiate level, was it was literally just hanging out with your friends all the time. Like you move, long distances, and you just shoot the shit constantly with your buds. And that's really what it should be. It's a perfect time to talk about really whatever you want to talk about with your buddies. But the other part of it is you should get done with it. And in the back of your mind, you should be saying to yourself, like, I could for sure do that again. I'm not saying you should do it again, right? Your body needs to recover. You need to, build volume over time. But if you get done with 40 minutes in zone 2, you should get done with it and say to yourself, oh, I could for sure run another 40 minutes at that effort. And I probably wouldn't feel much, I'll feel a little more fatigued because it's 40 more minutes on my feet, but I'm not going to be trashed after that next 40 minutes. And I think those two measurements are really important. Scott and I were actually just talking about that yesterday. Not everybody has access to the heart rate monitors or the GPS watches, especially when we talk enlisted personnel, 18 years old, just got in the Army. The last thing you want to do to that, private is say, go buy a $700 GPS watch and a $100 heart rate monitor, and then we can start training. Like, that's ridiculous. And so coming up with those measures that you can just say, hey, hold a conversation for the next 60 minutes. And if you can't, continue to slow down until you can hold that conversation, I think is a great starting space.
I think that idea is so alien to most of the Army, though. The idea of finishing physical training and feeling like good and fresh and ready to keep going. Because I think the one thing we've successfully beaten into people's heads culturally is that it should be like maximal suffering tends to be a good measure of like what right looks like, quote unquote. I'm making air quotes, people can't see it. But I think the idea that there are other measures that we might use to determine whether training was effective other than the amount of suffering or like how people look at the end of it. Yeah. I think we got a lot of first sergeants whose opinions we might need to change about what soldiers should look like at the end of PT.
I think about when I'm blocking out like my personal training, if I ever blocked out a day that I was like, this day is going to make or break me, then I've blocked out the training all wrong. Right. The goal of every day is not to come in and swing the hammer hard every day. The goal is to be ready to swing the hammer hard when that time comes. And the only way you do that is to build huge vats of consistency in your training. And it takes an enormous amount of time. I think, another issue we face in the force is, and just in culture in general, is people want immediate results. And so they'll do 4 weeks of endurance training, and then they'll see the dude getting shredded on Instagram, and they'll be like, nah, I'm going to go, build my physique now for 4 weeks. And then all of a sudden they see someone do an incredible feat of strength, and they're like, I'm just going to train like a strong man for 4 weeks. And while you're being active, and that's great, and it's going to contribute to, a longer lasting life, what you're not building is the consistency and an energy system to really adopt, a deep change in your body that's substantial, long lasting, and relevant to your occupation. And I think it's just super difficult to stay the course and keep that consistency. But no one day will ever be worth the block that surrounds it.
So I'm going to make an assumption here and say that you probably don't have unlimited time to train for Best Ranger anymore. So what have you taken from that sort of train up, and how have you mapped your training given the existing constraints? Because I think one thing we kind of want to tease out of this is to get ahead of some of the feedback we'll get, which is, oh yeah, like this is great. He had all this time to do all these things and had access to all this stuff. But I think a very important point is that you're now essentially in the conventional Army. You're now working the same as anybody else who would be working in the Army. So what does your training look like now as compared to when you were training up for Best Ranger?
Yeah, so I start every day with aerobic conditioning of some sort, whether that's a shorter run or a longer run, is really time dependent on when I have to be in the office. But I try to start every day with aerobic conditioning and calisthenic work. At the end of the day, calisthenics in the Army are not going away, and your ability to pull up on a bar or climb a rope or, do push-ups are important to just your overall capacity to work over time. And it doesn't take a lot of work every day to keep those things sharp. It just takes a little work consistently, kind of like we were just talking about. So I start with an aerobic session into some sort of calisthenics. And then if time permits in the afternoon, I'll go lift. I oftentimes will go lift during lunch. And then eat my lunch at my desk afterwards. And that way I'm kind of prioritizing or protecting, the training in the way I best can. Understanding that, on the days that my job requires me to sit at my desk through lunch and complete a task, then that's what I'm going to do. And I'm not going to commiserate over that missed training session, because like I just said, there's no one day that's going to, make or break the project I'm currently working on. And then the other big takeaway I got from, the strength coaches I had worked with is really maximizing your time in the gym. I think too often as strength athletes, guys will almost stand around for too long, and you're losing a bunch of time to checking your phone or talking to someone or, resetting your bar. And when I go in the gym, I try to be very deliberate with, hey, this workout is going to take me 40 minutes, but the most recovery maybe I have between lifts is 60 seconds or 45 seconds or a minute 15, depending on the protocol, I'm currently in. And managing that rest better, all of a sudden you get done with a 40-minute workout and you're like, my legs are smoked right now. I feel like I've gotten the effect I want to get, and I can go back and the next day I can repeat it. It's repeatable, and thus it becomes consistent over time. A great workout I was introduced to was a 12-minute deadlift protocol, which was one pull every 30 seconds for 12 minutes at about 80 to 90% of your 3-rep max. It's not beautiful on paper, and you do the first pull and you're like, that's not bad, and then you get to minute 10, 11 and you're like, oh, this is starting to suck. And after 12 minutes, you've done 24 pulls at 85% of your 3-rep max. And all you've really trained is your neurological ability to pull that weight, right? You're training muscle fibers to shoot in a certain pattern repeatedly. And all of a sudden I'm seeing returns in my ability to pull heavier weight, not by increasing my body weight, but by just increasing my neurological ability to fire under duress in the right ways. And so becoming more intentional and more deliberate and almost forcing myself to reduce the training time in the gym and not treat it like an hour run or a 2-hour aerobic session. That's much different, I think, has helped maximize the training I can get in.
I will say Vince has one significant unfair advantage in the conditioning space. I used to live in Colorado, and it's so much easier to run when you're running in those mountains.
Yes.
It's just way better.
Yeah. No, it's been a huge blessing.
Hey man, Fort Bragg is beautiful. So I'm glad you brought up the strength thing, because that again is one thing that we talk about a lot, because I go back to the conversation that we have all the time, which is we're seeing a lot of strength and conditioning coaches with varying levels of experience come into this space. A lot of tactical athletes themselves with varying levels of experience trying to figure out training, especially when we look at having a new test that has a strength component, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my question is specific to Best Ranger, and then even now in your own training, can you give kind of an overview of how you approach the strength piece of things so that it does not conflict with this massive amount of aerobic volume that it sounds like you're still hitting, even though it may not be 100 miles per week like it used to be?
Yeah, so I try to prioritize based on, what I'm training for. I think it's important, regardless of what you're doing in the Army, you should try and get something on the calendar outside of work that excites you, because training just to train is not sustainable. You need a goal, so that you can go through the periods of training appropriately. And then on the other side of that, you can go into your recovery cycle. And it's also important to link that up with your work schedule, right? Like if you have an NTC or JRTC coming up, well, then you should cycle to hit something big right before NTC, JRTC, and use that training cycle then as your rest and recovery space. But to answer your question on kind of how I'm thinking about strength, for instance, Saturday, this upcoming Saturday, I'll be running the Silver Rush 50 mile. And that's up at 10,000, 12,000 feet. It's over a few mountain passes. So I sat down with, what are the physical requirements in order to complete this event to the best of my ability? And the big thing I kept coming back to was eccentric loading of the quads, right? The ability to endure a high level of pounding for a long amount of time. I can't replicate that with the time I have out on the trails, right? I can't disappear for 4 or 5 hours on the trails during the work week, and then on the weekend I want to spend time with my wife and my daughter. So I can't replicate these massive training blocks that I otherwise would to be successful. So how can I maximize that time in the gym? And I kept coming back to eccentric loading, right? Hey, instead of just putting a barbell on your back and back squatting, maybe it's a lighter weight, but it's a 5 count on the descent, and then you're exploding up through back to reset, and trying to find how can I maximize a skill set that I need that I cannot train because of time restraints in the gym. And then just, using the internet or using, other coaches or using, people, are pretty well versed in the space to say, hey, I can't train this skill right now because of time constraints. How can I replicate it in a gym setting? And then, take that workout, add it in, superset it with a complementary muscle group, and you've got yourself the start of a halfway decent program.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think when we talk about concurrent training and people approach it from I'll say people that approach it from a strength background, you hear a lot this conversation around minimum effective dose and like trimming the fat, focusing only on what's important. And to kind of cap what you just said, it sounds like you're taking a very surgical approach to your strength work, in the sense that it complements, like you said, whatever goal you have on the calendar. You're not just mindlessly doing sets and reps because some textbook says that XYZ equals strength. You've tailored it to what you need, and you've done no more than that, because anything excessive would start to create conflict when we think about total training volume, recovery required, even some of the intangibles, like you mentioned, time with your family. I mean, that all kind of plays into things when we think about the total athlete. I realize I'm nerding out a little bit, but it's just refreshing to hear somebody who's become very surgical with their strength dosing.
Yeah, and I think, if you start to model your training that way, you can become a lot more effective during PT, right? You can start to make decisions about, okay, well, today is an easy 30-minute run. Well, maybe I prioritize my strength before the easy 30-minute run, because I know the return I'm looking for in that zone 2 run is really a cardiovascular effect and not a leg conditioning effect, right? So I reprioritize my strength work ahead of my aerobic work for that day. But then on the day that I have, a long run, or I'm doing some sort of interval session, or where the work is a little more substantive, then I'm going to prioritize that ahead of my strength work and figure out, okay, I'm coming off of this, my legs are super fatigued. Maybe it's a day to, go after the lower back and core and strengthen up some of the peripheral muscles to be successful. But I think, too often we go to the gym with a plan that's written down, and we're like, oh, it says 5 by 5. I have to hit 5 by 5. Well, if you get through 3 sets and you're like, if I go to 4 sets right now, I'm going to degrade my ability to do this tomorrow. Well, then you're done at 3, and you just move on, through the workout, so that the next day when you wake up, you can continue to build that consistency over time and make repeatable efforts day after day after day, which leads to more substantial growth.
So you've brushed up against this a little bit, and I like what you said about getting something on the calendar outside of work and like knowing what you're training for and structuring around that. But given that a pretty tremendous portion of the conventional military and tactical professions in general are mostly concerned with whatever test they're going to be forced to take. Mm-hmm. Do you think, and this is based on a little bit of what I've seen, I kind of worry that we have a pendulum effect going on. We were like very much towards like muscular endurance, cardio kind of stuff under the APFT, no real consideration of actual strength or anything like higher intensity or anything like that.
Yeah.
And now we're swinging in the opposite direction. We're swinging very much towards strength, very much towards high intensity, short duration kind of stuff, to the point that like, I think most people would agree that a 560 ACFT score would be considered pretty good in most places. And you can get a 560 ACFT running a 22-minute 2-mile, as long as you're good at everything else.
Yeah.
I worry that the pendulum has swung kind of too far in that direction. And I don't know how we bring it back. Is that consistent with what you've seen? What do you think?
Yes, it's definitely consistent. I think, not to bash the people I work for, but making the test so doable is at detriment to our soldiers and our community. If you think that a 22-minute 2-mile is acceptable, I would say you're probably wrong. You are probably not ready for the realities of whatever your job is going to be. you can look at the invasion of Ukraine, for example. Um, Russian tanks ran out of fuel, within a few days. Eventually, if your logistics don't meet your supply, your vehicle is going to shut down. What do you have to do when your vehicle shuts down? Well, you're going to have to eventually move to cover, and you're going to have to, if you want to continue to seize the initiative, you're going to have to begin to move on foot, right? So regardless of what you think your job is, and this is getting into the hypothetical again, it can always shift in the realities of our workspace. And so I think making the test um, so diluted in that sense is at detriment to the force as a whole. Because the individuals I see that run 22 minutes, that maybe they don't even prioritize anything else, right? They're not even concerned with the strength stuff, but they can still run 22 minutes, and you look at them and you kind of think, I'm not confident in your ability to do your job when it comes to physicality, and that's a huge issue. And I'll tell you right now, as a runner, I've also come to terms with the fact that the opposite is true as well. If the Army tells me that 340 is the max for the 3 repetition deadlift, I'm going to chase 340, right? And if the max of the test is I don't even know what it is for the 2 mile, 1330, I think. Yeah,
Yeah, I think
1330.
so.
Then you should chase 1330. But when you make the test so easy to pass, people are just going to disregard physical training because they don't need to physically train to pass the minimum standard. And I think that's sad.
I'm going to assume some risk here and hopefully not get fired for the next few sentences that I say. But if I recall the history correctly, the reason we changed the test was because of a recognition that the way we were training was not appropriate and the level of fitness that our force had was not sufficient to meet the demands of combat. And so then we changed the test, and we acted surprised when people struggled with it, even though the whole point was to reveal that shortfall. And so we adjusted passing to make sure that people could do it as they currently stood. Well, I think we kind of bamboozled ourselves somewhere in there, right? Because the whole point was that we weren't meeting the expectations that were necessary for combat. We should not have been surprised that people struggled with it. We should have spent more time figuring out how to fix that problem, not lower the bar. But that is a whole separate conversation that I will not continue down that rabbit hole, or else I'll get in trouble.
Listen, if bad data supports your case, it's good data, I think, is the takeaway. But so we're getting close to the hour mark, and this is an excellent segue for like a closing $1 million question for you, Vince. If you were given the keys to the Army to revamp PT, and we can include testing in there as well for the sake of hypotheticals, give us an overview about what that might look like.
So, I mean, there would be a huge prioritization in aerobic conditioning. And kind of like I had said, that would occur, most likely in the mornings. I think ruck walking has a time and place, when you're getting ready for long field problems, has a time and place. And you would empower team leaders to use, and squad leaders to use time in their afternoons and white space during the day to get after, strength components in the gym. And it wouldn't have a dogma of, oh, they're not at work right now. Well, like kind of what Alex said, in fact, they're exactly where they should be. They're training, physically and reinforcing that our job first and foremost is a physical job. And your physical capacity matters. And kind of getting to, what a test would look like, because as we've kind of alluded to, that people are ultimately always going to train for, the test. They're going to see this is standard. I'm going to try and build something around it. I think moving something similar to the 75th Ranger Regiment's RPAT, where you're in a kit helmet, you're simulating some sort of run, you're getting over a wall barrier, you're dragging sled, simulating casualties. And then there's just a time standard, but removing, points in the sense of, hey, this is the max points you can get, and this is the minimum points you can get. And just having one time standard and saying like, hey, if you can meet this time standard in this activity, you're qualified to do your job. Right. I think too often, because we have this stratified point scale, people see themselves and they're like, for example, the APFT. Oh, I'm a 220 guy. I'll never be a 300 guy, so I'm just not going to try. If the end goal seems too far away, people are not going to work for it because it seems improbable to them to reach. But if you just make it, hey, one standard, and if you pass the standard, it's just a go, no go check on your OER, or, your NCOER or whatever it is, then all of a sudden you've reframed the mindset of the training to just, hey, these are the minimum standards. And if I meet the minimum standards and they're difficult to, meet, with some level of difficulty, then I'm qualified to do my job in the Army. And I think moving, towards something like that would be a huge, huge win.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Well, Vince, thank you for taking the time. Thank you for talking with us. This has been incredibly insightful, and congrats again on the win. Are you going to go back and try for a repeat?
We'll see. We'll see where the Army takes us.
Not a no.
No, I think one day, we'll give it another go. But like everything in the Army, it's timing and the things have to line up right for it to work out. So
in the meantime, enjoy those mountains. I'm jealous.
I will every day.